When we carefully examine the Great Revolt and Masada, a portrait of heroism is simply not provided. On the contrary, the narrative conveys the story of a doomed and questionable revolt, of a majestic failure and destruction of the Second Temple and of Jerusalem, of large-scale massacres of the Jews, of different factions of Jews fighting and killing each other, of collective suicide, an act not viewed favorably by the Jewish faith, by a group of terrorists and assassins whose fighting spirit may have been questionable. Understandably, views such as these have raised the hackles of many Jewish historians. But is Ben Yehuda's interpretation of events correct? How much of the Masada story is history, and how much is myth? There are two major sources we can refer to in order to analyze this question. The first is the only contemporary account of the siege written by the Jewish historian Josephus. The second is the archaeological evidence that was unearthed by the Israeli archaeologist Yigael Yadin during his major excavation of the site between 1963 and 1965. Both sources agree on the basic storyline. Jewish rebels seized the fortress around 66 BC by treachery, according to Josephus, and killed the Roman garrison. Josephus tells us that another group of rebels under the leadership of Eleazar ben Yair fled to Masada after the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. Yadin's excavations support this period of occupation by way of numerous small finds, including scrolls, pottery, weapons, clothes, and Jewish coins dating up to the year of the siege. The fact that there was a siege is also beyond doubt. The remains of the Roman circumvallation and siege camp, along with the great ramp Silva had constructed abutting the western approach to Masada, are still visible. From this point, however, the facts are open to interpretation. Were the defenders of Masada a group of religious zealots who fought a heroic but doomed guerrilla war against an overwhelmingly superior adversary? Certainly Josephus's account does not reflect this view. In fact, he shows nothing but contempt for the defenders of the fortress, whom he describes as Sakari, an extremist group that committed murder in order to obtain their political objectives. They took their name from the Sikai, or small daggers concealed under their cloaks with which they stabbed their opponents, almost exclusively fellow Jews who they perceived as too moderate or openly sympathetic to Roman rule. These Sicarii, Josephus states, quote, strove with one another in their single capacity and in their communities, who should run the greatest lengths in impiety towards God and in unjust actions towards their neighbors, end quote. Nowhere in his account of the Masada siege does Josephus make any reference to the defenders taking the initiative against the Roman army, even though many contemporary versions credit them with waging a guerrilla war against the Romans for up to 3 years. This omission cannot be attributed to pro-Roman bias on Josephus's part. He includes stories of Jewish attacks among the Romans at both Jerusalem and Machaerus in other parts of his narrative. The most likely reason that there is no mention of attacks being launched against the Romans at Masada is because the defenders never launched any. In fact, the only military action of any size that he attributes to them is a raid on the nearby Jewish settlement of Ein Gedi, during which they slaughtered more than 700 of their co-religionists, many of them women and children. Regarding the conduct of the siege, Josephus tells us that Silva set his army to work moving thousands of tons of earth and stone to construct a rampart 375 high abutting the western approach to Masada. Excavations at the site, however, indicate that Josephus may be mistaken or deliberately misleading on this point, as there is an extant spur of rock that the Romans used as a foundation for their construction. This meant they only had to add 25 to 30 feet to this natural feature in order to raise the ramp to the level of the fortress's walls. The time required to complete this engineering feat would have been significantly less than building it from the ground up, which would have a resulting impact on the length of the siege itself. Rather than being a long and heroic resistance, the whole episode may have been over in as little as a month. Josephus is quite specific about how the defenders of Masada met their end. When the Romans had completed their siege works and defeat was inevitable, they chose to kill themselves rather than fall into captivity. Each man first executed his own wife and children. Then 10 men were chosen by lot to kill the survivors. These remaining 10 then drew lots to establish which among them would kill the other 9. Yadin's excavations uncovered a cluster of 11 small ostraka in front of the palace. Each of these was inscribed with a single name, including one that reads Ben Yair. Yadin believed these to be the lots used by the last survivors to decide which of their number would kill the others before ending his own life. However, if this is the case, it begs the question, why are there 11 names inscribed instead of the 10 specified by Josephus? Having dispatched his compatriots, the sole survivor is stated to have set fire to the fortress, with the exception of the well-supplied storehouses that, according to Josephus, were left intact to show the Romans that the defenders had not been subdued for want of necessaries. This appears to contradict the archaeological evidence. When the storerooms were excavated, the original floor was covered with a thick layer of ash, indicating that they also were put to the torch. Josephus was specific about the number of people besieged at Masada: 967 men, women, and children. He also states that, with the exception of 2 women and 5 children who hid themselves in the caverns beneath the citadel, that they all perished. He is equally specific about where they died: the royal palace. Yadin's excavations uncovered the remains of only 28 people. However, and of these, only 3 were discovered under the debris of the palace. The remainder were discovered in a cave at the base of the cliff. Yadin proposed that the remains were those of Masada's defenders, and went so far as to state that the 3 skeletons found in the palace undoubtedly represent the remains of an important commander of Masada and his family. He even went so far as to suggest that the man might have been the last warrior who, having killed his comrades, committed suicide next to the bodies of his wife and child. This interpretation appears to have been based solely on the fact that some armor was found near the remains. The theory was further weakened by one of Yadin's own team, an anthropologist, who estimated the man's age as between 20 and 22, the woman's between 17 and 18, and the child's about 11 or 12 years old at the time of death. If these estimations are correct, the grouping could not possibly constitute a nuclear family. The whereabouts of the remaining 932 bodies remains a mystery. Josephus makes no mention of the 25 bodies in the cave, so their origin is open to conjecture. Were they, as Shea Cohen believes, the remains of Jews who attempted to hide from the Romans but were discovered and killed? Which contradicts the popularly held belief that the entire population of Masada willingly committed mass suicide. Or are they the bodies of Christians who inhabited Masada during Byzantine times, as some scholars have suggested? Joseph Zayas of Jerusalem's Rockefeller Museum has yet another theory. After carbon dating samples of textiles found with the remains indicated that they appeared to be contemporaneous with the period of the revolt, he postulated that they could in fact be of Roman origin. Yedid admitted in 1982 that he had found pig bones alongside the remains, a highly unlikely combination if they were indeed those of zealous Jews to whom the pig is an unclean animal. But Zayas notes that Romans sacrificed pigs at burials. 14 of the skeletons were adult males, 6 of whom were described as between 35 and 50, powerfully built and of a distinctly different physical type from the rest. Could these be the remains of members of the Legion 10th Fretensis, who conducted the siege of Masada and occupied it after its recapture? As of the emblems of this legion was the boar, this would be a quite reasonable interpretation. A government committee overruled Yedin's suggestion that all these remains be interred in the cave where they were found. Instead, they were buried at Masada with full military honors on July 7, 1969. There are many apparent anomalies in the Masada story, and many of these can be traced to Yigal Yadin and his interpretation of the archaeological remains. Although a revered figure in Israel, he has been accused of interpreting his finds to fit with the heroic mythos of Masada. As to his motives for doing this, Ben Yehuda suggests nationalistic, ideological motivation played a very major part in the decision to excavate Masada. He also argues that a nation needs myths to help it shape a central process of nation and state building, to shape identities and create cohesion by fostering a strong sense of a shared past. This is particularly true of Israel at the time of Yedin's dig. Less than 2 decades old and surrounded on all sides by enemies dedicated to their destruction, Israel needed a new type of Jew, somebody that was willing to fight and die for his own country. Yedin interpreted the events at Masada in a way that provided the requisite role model. Wherever the truth lies, the Masada story still resonates strongly today, both as an enduring symbol of the Jewish state's struggle for existence and of human courage in the face of insurmountable opposition.